we are launching a brand new series here on Texas Today called The Weird Wild West. It is where we dig into the strange, surprising, and sometimes unbelievable moments from Central Texas history. And for our very first story, we are starting with a newsroom feud in Waco that escalated so bad it ended in a deadly street duel. So this happened on November 19, 1897, when Judge George Gerald, a 62-year-old Civil War veteran, confronted his rivals, Waco Times-Herald newspaper editors Tom and W.B. Harris, near Austin Avenue and 4th Street. It is important to note the judge only had use of one arm, making any fight an uneven match. So the men argued over an article the judge wrote and wanted to be featured in the newspaper. It supported a controversial magazine that denounced Baptist and Baylor University. So after a fist fight, which the judge lost, remember he only had one arm, he challenged the brothers to a duel. And they met at the intersection for the pistol battle. Now, both Harris brothers, they were killed. There's their graveyard in Waco. And the one-armed judge, well, he won re-election in 1900. So this a shootout made national headlines, and it cemented the Waco duel as one of the last true Wild West showdowns in Texas. This morning on the Weird Wild West, we're talking about one of Texas's most notorious outlaws, Sam Bass, and the one Central Texas town he reportedly refused to mess with. Sam Bass was a former cowboy turned train robber in the 1870s, best known for pulling off some of the biggest heists of his time. His gang targeted trains and stagecoaches in Nebraska and across Texas, stealing thousands in gold and cash and quickly landing him on the Texas Rangers' most wanted list. But according to legend, Bass had one hard rule: avoid Belton and Bell County altogether. On his way to rob a bank, he famously refused to enter Belton, saying, "Those Belton men are too much for me." Former Bell County attorney and Old West historian Rick Miller wrote in a book that Sam Bass was going to rob a bank in Belton, but felt the town wasn't worth the risk because of mob justice and lawlessness. That reputation alone was enough to keep Bass away. His run did not last forever, though. In 1878, Texas Rangers tracked him down to Round Rock, where a shootout left him badly wounded. He died from those injuries 2 days later on his 27th birthday. So it is believed that Sam Bass buried gold from those train robberies, and they are rumored to be hidden in Texas caves and mountains. And as far as that mob justice Sam Bass was referring to in Bell County, well, I will talk about that tomorrow on the Weird Wild West. We are taking you back to 1874, to one of the most violent nights in Belton and Bell County history. When the early hours of May 25th, 1874, while the sheriff was out of town on official business, a masked vigilante group of more than 100 men rode up to the Belton City Jail that still stands today at 210 Pearl Street. That's what you're looking at here. So inside, there were 10 prisoners charged with crimes ranging from robbery to horse theft. One was in jail for murdering his wife. So armed with axes, hatchets, and crowbars, the mob forced its way inside, tied up the jailer, and they broke through this massive jail lock. It's still on display at the Bell County Museum. And they killed 9 of 10 men inside of their cells. One prisoner survived because he was being held in another cell because he was sick. Well, at the time, supporters claimed the killings were meant to restore order in a lawless era. But the massacre, it did spark some outrage across Texas, and it raised serious questions about mob justice and the rule of law on the frontier. So originally, all of those men were buried together in the South Belton Cemetery, but community outcry led to a judge to have those bodies exhumed and reburied individually in unmarked graves. Well, this story is a reminder of how brutal justice could be in the Wild West. This morning, we are talking about a man whose name alone sounds like a Wild West tall tale. So say it with me: Telephus Telemachus Louis Augustus Albertus Johnson. And yes, that is his real name. Well, he died in Waco in 1875, but for generations, legends claim he went out in true frontier style, buried at a poker table with whiskey in one hand and a 6-shooter in the other. Well, Johnson was originally buried in Waco's historic First Street Cemetery, but when his remains were later moved to Oakwood, the myth was officially laid to rest. No poker table, no whiskey bottle, no gunfight in the grave. Still, the man lived large despite having only an elementary education. Well, Johnson became one of Waco's wealthiest citizens. He owned large portions of the town. He helped influence the construction of the McLennan County Courthouse. He built a home at 2nd and Mary, so the Waco Street is named for his wife. So while the legend may have been exaggerated, one thing is certain: with a name like Telephus Telemachus Louis Augustus Albertus Johnson, he was never going to be forgotten. We are riding into Milam County again, where politics once settled disputes the old-fashioned way. The most infamous political rivalry in county history came to a deadly end on June 20th of 1905, not in a saloon, but in the hallway of the courthouse itself. So former Sheriff Giles C. Averett and sitting Sheriff Robert Todd crossed paths, and moments later, gunfire echoed through the building. So newspapers reported 3 shots were fired. 2 from Sheriff Todd's Colt 45 hit Averett in the back. Averett later died. Now, Todd immediately surrendered and later claimed self-defense. So he spent time locked up in the county jail while a trial played out. In the end, Todd was acquitted. He even finished his term as sheriff and later went on to serve as the Milam County Treasurer. So if you ever visit the Milam County Courthouse, look at that. There's still a bullet hole in the courtroom door frame. But here's the strangest part. These 2 gunmen were once best friends until politics turned them into bitter rivals because they were trading wins in back-to-back sheriff elections, and it caused their feud to boil over. So in Milam County, the Wild West didn't just ride through town. It walked straight to the courthouse. We are headed back to a time when Central Texas entertainment had fewer safety rules and a lot more steam. It was September 15th, 1896, and just north of Waco, a temporary town called Crush, Texas, popped up for what promoters proudly called the Duel of Iron Monsters. But the main attraction was 2 massive steam locomotives, each weighing about 35 tons, aimed straight at each other for a head-on collision. Railroad officials promised a safe show, and about 40,000 Texans showed up, making Crush briefly the 2nd largest city in the state. So at 5 p.m., the 2 iron giants roared toward each other at about 50 miles per hour. Now, when the locomotives met, the boilers exploded and at least 2 people were killed and several others injured by flying debris, including a Waco photographer who lost an eye. The crowd rushed to the smoldering pile of debris looking to get souvenirs, not realizing this would burn their hands. Well, the man behind the publicity stunt is the man you just saw there. That was William G. Crush. He was fired by the railroad for the disaster, but in true Texas fashion, he was rehired the very next day because, believe it or not, this publicity stunt worked. Ticket sales and interest in rail travel spiked after this event. Wow. So 2 iron monsters, one very bad idea, and thousands who came to watch, only in Texas and only in the weird Wild West. We are saddling up with one of Milam County's most twisted frontier tales, the story of William Sherrod Robinson, a man who wore the badge before he stole its honor. So Robinson was a Milam County deputy sheriff in the 1870s, but here's where this tale takes a turn. Well, Robinson didn't just chase outlaws, he eventually became one. He helped hand over a prisoner to a mob looking for fast frontier justice, and by the late 1870s, he formed his own gang, stealing horses and robbing stores across counties. Well, after being jailed and out on bail, Robinson left Texas, leaving behind his wife and 4 children. He became known as Ben Wheeler, drifting through Wyoming and Nebraska before settling in Kansas. But another twist, he snagged a job as a deputy city marshal, and in 1884, he joined a crew to rob a bank, but the holdup turned deadly. So Robinson was caught, and a mob pulled him from the jail. Now, he begged for mercy, but it didn't come. He was lynched by an angry crowd, ending his outlaw days in the harshest way the Old West could offer. We are digging into a frontier fort that once stood guard over Central Texas, long before Fort Hood, long before today's soldiers, and closer to the days of Buffalo and Comanche raids. So Fort Gates was founded in 1849 and was just south of present-day Gatesville. Well, the Army post was meant to protect settlers and keep the peace on the wild Texas frontier. So its troopers rode hard, guarding wagon trains and trying to keep outlaws and hostile raids at bay. So life at Fort Gates wasn't exactly comfortable. The post struggled to maintain fresh water and food. Soldiers lived in blockhouses, and they had to fight off rattlesnakes. And by the mid-1850s, as settlement expanded and Indian raids became less frequent, the Army pulled back and Fort Gates was abandoned. So fast forward to today. Central Texas is home to Fort Hood, one of the largest military installations in the nation, a place where soldiers train and serve just as those early troopers did more than 170 years ago, but with more comfort, armor, and high-tech gear. Coryell County, where justice once came with a rope, a scaffold, and a town full of witnesses. So Jim Leeper and Ed Powell were convicted of robbery and murder along the Lampasas Road in 1889. So they were caught within a day. The evidence against them stacked up fast, the trial moved even faster, and the verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. Punishment was death. Well, appeals were filed, bribes attempted, but on September 29th, 1891, a massive crowd gathered around the Gatesville jail. Guards lined the rooftops. The twin gallows that you see there, they stood ready. At exactly 2 o'clock, the trap was sprung. And in the Weird Wild West, court dates didn't always end with appeals. Sometimes they ended at the gallows. We are following the trail of a ranger lost to history and found again 180 years later. His name was James Coryell, one of the earliest Texas Rangers, a frontiersman known for protecting early settlers in the young Republic of Texas. So Coryell County is named after him, and in May of 1837, Coryell and his ranger company, they were in Falls County when they stumbled upon a bee tree. So what should have been a snack turned into a deadly encounter with Native Americans. Coryell was shot, scalped, and left for dead. A rescue party found him wounded. He was carried back to the settlement only to die 2 days later. Now, for generations, historians searched for his grave until clues in oral history from a former slave community pointed researchers to a burial site near Bull Hill Cemetery. Bull Hill is an African-American historic cemetery near Marlin. In 2010, archaeologists from the Texas Historical Commission uncovered a cluster of rocks, making a grave shaft. Initial DNA tests failed to confirm it, but advanced analysis years later revealed enough viable DNA to finally confirm the remains belonged to James Coryell, solving a nearly 2-century mystery. So Coryell's rediscovered grave not only honors one of the early Texas Rangers, it also deepens our understanding of early Texas frontier life, a place where danger, sacrifice, and legend rolled hand in hand. We are riding into Temple, a town with a past so muddy it literally tripped people up. Before it was Temple, Texas, this place answered to a much rowdier name, Tanglefoot. And no, that wasn't a dance move. It was a warning. So according to historians, back in the 1800s, Temple streets were thick with mud. The saloons, they were thick with whiskey, and the town was thick with what they politely called tough characters. So locals said between the sticky streets and the strong liquor, it was nearly impossible to walk straight. Your boots tangled, your feet slipped, and just like that, Tanglefoot was born. Some even called it Mud Town, because after a good rain or a long night at the saloon, Temple could knock you flat without firing a single shot. So fast forward to today, and that rough and tumble nickname lives on in a much friendlier way. So the Tanglefoot Festival gets its name straight from those Wild West roots, turning Temple's muddy, whiskey-soaked past into music, food, dancing, and a whole lot of Texas right. We tip our hats to one of the toughest frontiersmen ever to ride out of Central Texas. A man they called the Wolf Catcher, born in Bosque County in 1876. So folks whispered that Jack Abernathy could catch a wolf with his bare hands. No trap, no rope, no rifle, just grit, muscle, and a fearless grin. Well, working as a cowboy, Abernathy, he sold the wolves to zoos, a circus, and traveling shows. So his legend reached all the way to the White House. President Theodore Roosevelt took a liking to Abernathy's frontier toughness. In fact, Roosevelt appointed him a job as a U.S. Marshal, handling Native American affairs. But that is not all. Jack Abernathy passed the frontier spirit down to his sons. So listen to this. In 1910, at the age of 5 and 9, Lewis and Temple Abernathy became sensations when they rode alone from Oklahoma to New Mexico by horseback, alone. And take a look at this picture. I'm getting ready to tell you about that shortly. The next year, they rode their horse from Oklahoma to New York to meet President Roosevelt. And if that is not enough, this next part might shock you. The boys purchased a small brush motor car and they drove it back home to Guthrie, Oklahoma. Here they are. Once again, they did it alone. So this just goes to show that Jack Abernathy didn't just leave a legend, he raised them. So we are digging into the early missteps of one of America's most infamous outlaws, Clyde Barrow, and his tumble through Waco before he hit the national headlines. So before Bonnie and Clyde became a household name, Clyde was just a young troublemaker making headlines in Waco. In October of 1929, Waco police arrested him for burglary and car theft. In March of 1930, he was arrested again in the McLennan County Jail on charges including burglary and stealing a vehicle. While waiting to transfer to the state penitentiary in Huntsville, a bold jailbreak unfolded with help from a gun smuggled into his cell. Now, that was reportedly by Bonnie Parker herself. So Barrow and 2 other inmates overpowered jail staff and escaped. Well, that escape in Waco marked the beginning of what would become a nationwide crime spree. So from there, Clyde and Bonnie, they hit the road in classic Wild West outlaw fashion, robbing banks and stores from Texas to the Midwest. Their violent partnership, though, it came to a bloody end in 1934 when law officers ambushed them in Louisiana. Whether you're going to be curled up with snacks or sinking into the couch for a true crime marathon tonight, take a bow to Waco, the city that helped turn America into a nation of true crime couch detectives. So in 1955, Waco became the first place in the country to broadcast a murder trial live. From opening statements to the final verdict, right from the McLennan County Courthouse. So the case was the trial of Harry Leonard Washburn, accused of murder in the shocking bombing death of his former mother-in-law. So viewers watched as evidence, testimony, intense courtroom drama played out on their TV screens. So cameras rolled, microphones captured every word, and suddenly justice wasn't just happening in the courtroom. It was happening in living rooms across Texas. Stores were empty, streets went quiet, and people stayed home glued to their TVs. So that broadcast cracked the door open for courtroom television, crime documentaries, and the true crime obsession so many of us indulge in today. So fast forward to now. It's Friday, and as you settle in for a night of true crime, remember, the Wild West didn't just give us outlaws and gunfights. It gave us must-see courtroom TV. We are taking you to Salado, where the toughest lawmen didn't carry badges. They carried knitting needles. So let's roll it back to 1882, when word spread that this building was turning into a saloon. Well, the men were okay with it, but the women said absolutely not, fearing the moral, cultural, and religious downfall of Salado. So the ladies hatched a plan so polite, it was diabolical. 2 at a time every day, they parked themselves in front of the saloon doors, knitting calmly, no yelling, no signs, just needles clicking and judgment hanging in the air. The results? Well, no drinking happened, and the men, they rarely visited the saloon. So the owner packed up and moved to Holland, and out of spite, named his new bar the Salado Saloon. So remember, in the weird Wild West of Salado, the most powerful weapon wasn't a 6-shooter. it was yarn. I told you about Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker's tie to Central Texas. Well, this morning on the Weird Wild West, we are tipping our hat to the Central Texas lawmen who finally brought them to a stop. So before sirens, radios, and squad cars, there was Frank Pancho Hamer, a Texas Ranger carved straight out of the frontier limestone. So he was born in San Saba County. Now Hamer, he joined the Texas Rangers in 1905 and spent decades chasing smugglers, bandits, and outlaws. So he survived more than 50 gunfights and walked away with 17 bullet wounds to prove it. So by the 1930s, America had a problem. Bonnie and Clyde. The police couldn't catch them, so they called the one man who still knew how to hunt. Frank Hamer came out of retirement, studied their moves, and followed their trail. Then on May 23rd, 1934, on a lonely Louisiana back road, he and his posse sprang the trap, and in seconds, the outlaw legend ended in a storm of gunfire. So the killing of Bonnie and Clyde made national headlines, and Hamer shied away from the attention and refused any interviews about the investigation. So this goes to show that in the Weird Wild West, it took an old school ranger to bring down America's most modern outlaws. This morning on the Weird Wild West, we are headed to Mahia, a town that once earned the nickname the Sin City of Texas. When oil came gushing out of the ground, Mahia didn't just strike it rich, it struck trouble, and the quiet Central Texas town became one of the most lawless places in the state. So in the early 1920s, Mahia was a quiet farming town until black gold blew out the ground. Almost overnight, oil derricks shot up, and so did the population. So the population in Mahia increased from 4,000 to 50,000 within days after oil discovery. Now, with oil money flowing, Mahia exploded into chaos. Tent cities popped up, prostitution was everywhere, and law enforcement struggled to keep up. And where there is oil money, there is booze. Despite prohibition, Mahia was soaked in what they called back then hard liquor, which was homemade alcohol. So according to local newspapers, there were killings just for fun, and a constable was shot dead in the street. But just as fast as the oil boom came, it faded, leaving behind stories of fast money, faster living, and a chapter written in oil and whiskey. So in 1922, Governor Pat Neff responded to the chaos by declaring martial law. He sent in the Texas Rangers and the National Guard. Back then, Mahia proved the Wild West didn't always ride in on horseback. Sometimes it gushed straight out of the ground. We are bundling up for a moment when Central Texas froze solid and Waco turned into a winter wonderland. In February of 1899, the Great Arctic Outbreak, known as the Big Chill, slammed Texas with record-breaking cold. In Waco, temperatures plunged to around 10 degrees below zero. The cold was so intense that the Brazos River froze over. It's a river that almost never ices up. But locals ice skated right across the river, drawing crowds who could hardly believe their eyes. Photographs and newspaper accounts describe wagon crossing the frozen river. There was livestock struggling to survive, and families huddled around fires as the deep freeze lingered for days. Pipes burst, crops failed, and daily life came to a standstill. Now, it took another 122 years before the Brazos River froze in Waco again, and that was during the 2021 polar vortex, which ironically happened in February too. A Waco connection to one of the most famous songs in the state of Texas. So before the eyes of Texas echoed through packed stadiums in Austin, it started with a man who called Waco home. William Prather was a Waco attorney in the late 1800s before becoming president of the University of Texas. During his time leading UT, Prather had a favorite phrase he liked to tell students: "The eyes of Texas are upon you." So he borrowed the line from a saying associated with General Robert E. Lee, and he used it as a reminder to students to act with integrity and responsibility. So in 1903, a group of UT students took that phrase and turned it into what will become the university's alma mater, The Eyes of Texas. So yes, a little piece of Central Texas history helped inspire a song that is still sung more than a century later. Grudges age like bad whiskey, and two gunmen in their 50s decided retirement was overrated. So Pink Higgins and Bill Sandifer, well, they were both born and bred in Lampasas, both seasoned shooters and both with absolutely no use for one another. So they once worked together but started to dislike each other. Their long simmering dislike finally boiled over on October 4th, 1903, after Pink Higgins' oldest son represented Sandifer's wife in a bitter divorce proceeding. So Sandifer repeatedly cursed out Pink's son until Pink stepped in, warning that if it happened again, he'd back his son with a gun. So the hot-headed Sandifer fired back, challenging Pink to name the place and the time. Well, the two met on horseback at Pink's ranch with rifles in hand. Sandifer fired first, his bullet dropping Pink's horse in the dirt. Pink hit the ground, raised his rifle, and returned fire. When the smoke cleared Bill Sandifer, he lay dead. And Pink, who you see here on your screen, he was still standing. Now get this, in true Wild West fashion, Pink buried Sandifer right there on his land in a wooded patch. He called it Sandifer's Thicket. A grand jury later ruled the shooting self-defense, and Pink walked free. Proof that in the Old West you didn't need a witness, just better aim. So this morning's Weird Wild West story is just as sad as it is strange. One of the most famous images from early Waco shows a man standing in the middle of dusty Main Street around 1872, right in front of the newly built Waco Suspension Bridge. So the man with his hands resting on two Colt revolvers down near the bottom of your screen, that is believed to be Seth P. Mills, a rancher and Civil War veteran whose life was almost as dramatic as the Wild West itself. So Mills came to Central Texas after the Civil War and raised 9 children. He served multiple terms in the Texas legislature. But get this, Mills also had an unusual run-in with trains. In 1898, he was accidentally knocked from a train platform by a railroad worker and nearly killed by a passing locomotive, leaving him with a limp he carried until the rest of his life. So years later, tragedy struck again. In 1916, at age 74, Mills was leaving a railroad yard in Belmead when he stepped away from one track to avoid one train, only to be hit by another engine. Now, this horrific accident killed him and it stunned the entire community. But listen to this. Mills was first buried in Spiegelville. That area is now covered by the waters of Lake Waco. So beneath that lake lies the land of a man who survived a war, built a life from nothing, and was hit by a train not once, but twice. So this is just another unforgettable chapter from Central Texas' Weird Wild West. One of Texas's most controversial figures. His name is William Cowper Brand. He was a man who proved the pen could be just as deadly as any six-shooter. So in the 1890s, he launched his fiery newspaper, the Iconoclast. Well, Brand's writing blended beauty with brutality. He attacked churches, politicians, African Americans. No one was safe. And his fiercest target? Well, Baylor University, which he mocked as a storm center of misinformation. Supporters praised him, and his enemies, well, they plotted against him. And then came April 1st, 1898. Brand was shot in the back by a supporter, this man, whose daughter went to the university. But even while dying, he stayed true to his legend, pulling his own pistol and killing his attacker before collapsing. Well, Brand was buried in Waco's Oakwood Cemetery, where his monument is still there today, and it reads Truth, and it features a profile of Brand marked with a bullet hole in it. Meet Lee Wilder Thomas. As a young boy sitting in a Mexia church pew, he felt called to preach the gospel. He was educated right in Mexia, then headed off to Wiley College in Marshall, where he earned his degree. But when the Mexia oil boom hit in the 1920s, Thomas saw a different kind of revelation. While Mexia spiraled into chaos, this reverend read the signs, and they pointed straight to land leases and smart investments. So L.W. Thomas went to Oklahoma to establish a community called Summit. This was for African Americans, and it's near Muskogee. So he invested more than $100,000 in Muskogee or Muscogee County real estate and said the land was to be sold to African Americans with preference given to those from Texas. So if you've got a strange or surprising piece of Central Texas history you want us to explore, just send it my way. We'll uncover another unbelievable story tomorrow morning right here on the Weird Wild West.